The name's Bond. James Bond. You can consider that my audition for the role of James Bond. I know it's not been announced yet, but I am the next James Bond. I'm letting you in on the inside scoop. In all seriousness, today is going to be a very special episode. I'm going to go through all things James Bond, from my favorite James Bonds to my favorite James Bond movies and everything in between. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I'm very excited and I hope you are too. And before we begin, I'm here to tell you of your top secret mission, which is to subscribe to this channel. Your mission is also to like and comment on this video and any other video on this channel. The name's Bond. James Bond. Shaken, not stirred. Iconic lines in cinema, some of the most famous quotes ever. And it's all from the James Bond franchise, which is, I believe, officially the longest standing franchise in history. Certainly the most famous franchise with the most movies. I believe they have 25 movies. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's 25 and they're working on Bond 26. As I mentioned in the intro, I am actually the next choice for James Bond as an actor. I know I had to let you in on the inside scoop. I just couldn't keep the secret, so I'm sorry to the production company, but I had to spill. So I'm sure it'll be front page news everywhere tomorrow. But yeah, I really just wanted to talk about Bond. I'm definitely a big Bond fan. An interesting thing about me is that I actually didn't grow up with the Bond movies. I didn't see a James Bond movie until I was maybe 19 years old, I would say, which was clearly just last year. But in other words, I didn't grow up with them. I kind of came to them later. And then once I saw them, the very first James Bond movie I saw was A View to a Kill with Roger Moore. And then after that, I was really hooked. I continued. I then watched all of them within the next few months. I absolutely loved them. I think there was a great range of different people playing them. They all brought different things to the table, which is a great thing. And I just think it's an incredible character. I actually haven't read any of the original Ian Fleming books. Some people have, some haven't. People have different opinions on what's better, the movies or the books. Certainly the movies have opened it up to such a wider audience. I mean, James Bond is probably one of the, if not the most recognizable character in cinematic history and character really in any history. He's probably more famous than many real life people. An interesting thing about that is that Ian Fleming, I believe, he took from his experiences in the Second World War in intelligence, and he created the character of Bond as kind of a combination of several people he knew in the war. Those were obviously tough times. There were a lot of very daring individuals during those times. And as for the name, everyone thinks what a cool and sophisticated name, but from what I've read about Fleming, the reason he chose the name James Bond was he wanted to create the most bland name possible. And I do believe he also knew somebody named James Bond, if I'm correct. Again, I've read up on the history a lot over the years. I've researched it. I've watched a bunch of behind-the-scenes documentaries from all the movies. Interestingly enough, whenever I watch a movie, I'm almost more interested in if they have behind-the-scenes extras, bonus features, things like that. Especially when I was a kid. I know that these days DVDs are such a thing of the past, but I remember growing up with DVDs and being so interested in all the bonus features, the bonus discs. It's so foreign even to me today. I mean, DVDs even are so scarce. It's really interesting. But to get right into it, I'm just going to start. I thought a good place to start would be to list my favorite James Bond actors in order. Now, this is going to be very controversial, I know that. And I should state at the beginning that this is just my personal opinion. And I should also state that I actually liked all of the James Bond actors. I think they all did great work. I think they all brought different things to the table. And so I really don't think there was a bad choice for James Bond so far. And I really think that this is just my personal preference of what I like. So I wrote down the list and I'll refer to it. So number one, I would have to say, controversially, my favorite James Bond is Roger Moore. He was in the first James Bond movie I saw. He was the first person I saw as James Bond. I think that definitely makes a difference for people. I also love the humor he brings to it, the sophistication. I love that some people don't like when movies are too humorous like that. For example, my second choice for James Bond is Sean Connery. And really, they're very close. I love both of them in the role. I think that in terms of James Bond, when I think of James Bond, I would have to think of one or the other. They both had humor in the movies. They both had some grittiness. That they both were great. They had different strengths, different weaknesses. They played the role a little bit differently, but they both played it with elegance, sophistication, humor, which really is what set up the Bond franchise for the future. I think without either of them, without Roger Moore or Sean Connery, Bond wouldn't be what it is today. Roger Moore did 7 James Bond movies. Sean Connery did 6 official ones, and then he did Never Say Never Again, which is the unofficial James Bond movie, which was made by Kevin McClory, who was, again, a producer also on Thunderball, because he had some legal, a court awarded him some legal right to the Thunderball story. So he jumped in with the producers on the original Thunderball, and then he was allowed, through a lot of fighting, to make his remake of Thunderball, which was called Never Say Never Again. So yeah, Roger Moore, Sean Connery next. So obviously he was the first James Bond in the movies. I know that there was a TV version of one of the films a few years before the movie versions, and it was actually in America. I think they called the character Jimmy Bond instead of James Bond. But Sean Connery was definitely the first in a major motion picture. Ian Fleming actually didn't like the choice originally, which is interesting. He just thought that he wasn't at all like he envisioned the character. I know that the role was originally offered to Cary Grant. I know that Ian Fleming said that he wrote the role partially with Cary Grant in mind. He also thought that a bunch of other people, like he even mentioned Richard Burton would be great in the role. He mentioned a lot of people like that. I think what he wanted was a more established star in the role. He felt that that would be good. I don't think he was that picky. He talked about a bunch of different kind of people in the role. So that tells me that he really was looking for a star in the role. And Sean Connery was getting more well-known, but he wasn't a star. I think the producers liked that, though, because they didn't want someone to think, oh, there's Cary Grant in this movie. They wanted somebody who could be thought of as James Bond, not as just a movie star playing James Bond. And that's another thing that Sean Connery definitely felt he got typecast in the role. That was another reason he definitely wanted to step away. He had several disputes with the producers, in particular, I believe, Broccoli, more than Saltzman, I believe. On his last movie, I think he wouldn't come on set if Broccoli was on set. Cubby Broccoli, one of the producers. And actually, Cubby Broccoli ended up taking over, he ended up buying out Harry Saltzman, the other producer, so it ended up just being Broccoli eventually. And now his daughter, Barbara Broccoli, is obviously helming the franchise with Michael Wilson as well. So yeah, Roger Moore, Sean Connery. My third choice would have to be Pierce Brosnan. I think he took over the role in a great way. He definitely added that sophistication. There's definitely some humor there. So Pierce Brosnan. Next, I would actually say George Lazenby, who's a controversial choice. He only did one of the Bond movies, on Her Majesty's Secret Service. It was definitely an underrated movie at first, but I think it's been gaining acclaim since then. Now it's actually considered one of the best Bond movies. I'll get later on to where it places in my list. So again, George Lazenby, it's an interesting story. He was an Australian car salesman. He worked, I believe, as several things, a car salesman, then he worked as a male model. Finally, in a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, he ended up landing the role of James Bond. I believe he actually snuck into the casting office. All things that you can't do today. It would be much harder to do it in that way today. But it's really an incredible story, George Lazenby's story. And yeah, so for the next one, I would have to say Timothy Dalton. I think that he only did 2 movies. He's credited with bringing some more seriousness back to the franchise. Yeah, I thought he did a good job, and not my favorite, but I thought he did an absolutely solid job in the role. And finally, in last place, I'd put Daniel Craig. I thought that he did a great job in everything. I just felt those are my personal preferences for the role. And in particular, I love a lot of the older James Bond movies more. So in many ways, a lot of my favorites are older, and then progressively they become less and less my favorite the closer they are to the modern era. But I do love, one movie that I love from him is Skyfall. I think that was definitely his best James Bond movie. And again, I thought he did a great job in the role. And I'm just going through my personal preferences based on the movies and how the character is played, how they fit into the movie, interpretation, etc. So yeah, now that I've listed my favorite James Bond actors in the future, and now that I've announced that I am clearly the next James Bond, I can move on to some of my favorite James Bond movies. So, in first place, I would have to say Octopussy with Roger Moore. I would say that's definitely my favorite James Bond movie. I know that usually is not a movie that makes it high on anyone's list. I just think it's the perfect combination of non-stop action, the plot keeps moving, a bunch of humor, a great soundtrack, which is really important for me. I thought it has an incredible soundtrack. And yeah, I mean, the other movie, that's for Roger Moore. If I would have to choose my favorite Sean Connery movie, it would be From Russia with Love. I believe that was his favorite James Bond movie as well. It also has a great score, which is important. I think it has a great, simple plot. It was just the second one. They didn't have a crazy budget. It was just double the budget of Dr. No, so it wasn't that much money. They shot on location in Istanbul and obviously in Pinewood Studios. So again, I absolutely love the story. I love all of that. So Octopussy and From Russia with Love would have to be probably in my top two. Certainly my favorite Roger Moore and my favorite Sean Connery. So next, I would have to say For Your Eyes Only. That's with Roger Moore. And it was right after Moonraker when they decided to bring things back a little more realistically. It's famous for one of the grittier moments for Roger Moore when he shoves the car off the ledge with the guy in it. That's definitely one of the darker moments in the Roger Moore Bond franchise. Definitely a memorable one. So yeah, I mean, I just love everything about that movie. It has a great score as well, For Your Eyes Only, by Bill Conti, who's famous for scoring the Rocky movies. So it's a very different kind of score. In addition to the traditional Bond score, his song was great. I love, it has a lot of the classic elements. It has the skiing. It has all those classical elements for a Bond movie. It has a very memorable scene in Greece. I've actually been to that location, the Meteora, I believe it's called. Those monasteries on top of those great rock formations, which are absolutely spectacular. So again, love For Your Eyes Only. All right, so next on the list, I would have to say The Spy Who Loved Me. It's again with Roger Moore. This movie is not controversial. It's often thought of as Roger Moore's best Bond movie. It's probably not my absolute favorite, but definitely one of my favorites. It's also considered one of the greatest Bond movies of all time. Again, it has a great score. That has one of the most famous scores in the Bond movies with the song Nobody Does It Better. It's definitely considered either the first, second, third best Bond score ever. And it's considered, I would say, pretty consistently in the top 5 Bond movies ever made. It just has a great magical feel. It's just everything flows, everything seems to work in that movie. So again, no arguments from me here. I love that movie. All right, so on my list here, the next movie I wrote down is Goldfinger. Absolute classic. Everyone talks of it as their favorite Bond movie. Probably not my favorite of all time, but definitely one of my favorites. I love it. It's the first movie that incorporated all the classic elements of the Bond we know and love. The first one was Dr. No, then From Russia with Love. But Goldfinger was the first one to actually have a song with lyrics in the opening titles. Dr. No and From Russia with Love both had just an instrumental version of their themes in the beginning. And From Russia with Love included the song with lyrics sung by Matt Monro at the very end at the end credits instead of the beginning credits. And usually it ended up reversing. So they sang with lyrics in the beginning and then have just an instrumental at the end oftentimes these days. So Goldfinger was definitely one of those. It's inspired a lot of people. It's really the non-stop action. It's really one of the first modern action movies in that way. Again, From Russia with Love and Goldfinger, I believe they very much heavily relied on Hitchcock movies like North by Northwest, for example. They both definitely took from that inspiration. North by Northwest definitely set up the Bond franchise, in my opinion. I think that Hitchcock really... It would have always been interesting to see a Hitchcock Bond movie, but he never would have done it because he would have probably wanted more control and he would have wanted to create his own thing. But Hitchcock definitely paved the way for Bond. There's no question about it, in my opinion, as well as people like Cary Grant, who, I mean, the character of Bond clearly owes a debt to some of his roles, his on-screen persona. So that's Goldfinger. So next, I put Dr. No, a classic, the first James Bond movie. What to say about it? It's just a great James Bond movie. It really started the franchise. So, I mean, just by virtue of it being the very first one, setting the tone immediately, I think it definitely deserves a spot among the best Bond movies. So next would be A View to a Kill. As I mentioned, this was the first Bond movie I saw, so it always has a special place in my heart. I love Roger Moore in it. I love the jump off the Eiffel Tower is a very interesting sequence in that movie. I love that Paris location they use, as well as the San Francisco. I thought the use of the Golden Gate Bridge was absolutely genius. I thought, yeah, it's with Roger Moore. Christopher Walken was great as the villain in that movie. And it's really just an overall great action-adventure movie. I just love it. So next, I wrote On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the controversial one. This is the one-off starring George Lazenby. It's a very interesting movie. I think it's gained a lot more recognition recently. It was still successful when it came out. I think it was still one of the most successful movies in 1969, I believe. It has that memorable opening sequence in Portugal, I believe it was, where Lazenby, he looks to the camera, or maybe not at the camera, but he says, when the girl drives off and, you know, he's just been beaten up, he says, "This never happened to the other fella." And funnily enough, that wasn't in the original script. That was just something that Lazenby kept saying because he was coming right after Sean Connery. So he would always say, "Oh, I have to do this stunt. This never happened to the other fella," or things like that. And the director, Peter Hunt, who was actually an editor before, and he was promised this movie, as he was an editor, he kept staying on with the franchise because he was promised that he would eventually be able to direct a movie. This ended up being his chance to direct a movie. And it's really a funny story with him. I talked a little about George Lazenby already, but he pretended that he was an actor even though he'd never really acted to the producers. And when he was introduced to the director, he actually leveled with Peter Hunt and he told him, "I've never acted before in my life." And apparently Peter Hunt laughed so hard and he said that you just fooled two of the most ruthless men in the entire business, so I'll make you the next James Bond. He said, "You must be a pretty good actor then." That's a funny story. It's hard to imagine things like that happening today. That kind of old Hollywood magic spirit of, yeah, you know what, okay, let's take a chance. I just love that spirit of filmmaking. Love it, love it, love it. So that's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Next, I put The Man with the Golden Gun. Interesting one with Roger Moore and Christopher Lee plays the villain. He plays the man with the golden gun. Interestingly enough, I believe Christopher Lee was distantly related to Ian Fleming. They played golf together, actually, when he was still alive. And I believe that Ian Fleming wanted him to play the role of Dr. No in the original movie, Dr. No. But by the time Ian Fleming inquired to the producers about filling that part, they said they had already cast it. Though both movies ended up turning out great, Ian Fleming was already dead, obviously, by the time of Golden Gun. He died in '64, so I believe he died right before Goldfinger was released. So he died before the franchise really blew up in terms of on-screen. So yeah, Golden Gun, I think it's a great movie. I'm definitely a fan of Christopher Lee as well. He was also a big guy like me. And yeah, I don't know what else to say except that I like it. Then next, I said The Living Daylights for my choice for Timothy Dalton. I prefer that movie over License to Kill in terms of his catalog of Bond movies. It's definitely a memorable scene for that is with the cello, I believe, when they're sliding down the slope on the cello and when bullets are piercing through the cello. That was, I thought, a very creative thing. I thought that was very innovative. So again, I definitely like that movie if we're talking about Timothy Dalton's movies. And finally, last on my favorites list, I put Skyfall from Daniel Craig's era. Now, as I mentioned, when I was doing this list, I wanted to include at least one movie from every Bond. So if I would have to choose one from Daniel Craig, I would have to say Skyfall. I absolutely love that movie. I think they really hit the nail on the head. And I think it honestly is one of the best Bond movies there are. Certainly the best Bond movie in the modern age, in my opinion. Yeah, again, in terms of Daniel Craig's era, that's the one movie I would gravitate towards. Maybe not as much of a fan of the others as I am of a lot of the original Bond movies. Some others that I didn't mention, I mean, I love Thunderball as well. I love, the one thing about Thunderball is that underwater chase seems to go on forever at the end. But otherwise, I mean, I absolutely love the movie. I think it's a great movie. It also has a great theme with Tom Jones singing it. That has a very memorable theme. So, I mean, I even like You Only Live Twice is a good movie. And I should say, probably next on the list would be Diamonds Are Forever. A lot of people don't like it because this was towards the end of Sean Connery's tenure. This was after On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the producers lured Sean Connery back to the franchise. So he came back for Diamonds Are Forever. People don't like it because it's more campy. I love it. It has more humor. It's a little more unrealistic maybe. But I just think it's a great movie. Again, it has a great score. And yeah, not much more to say about that. So that's that. Those are my thoughts on all things James Bond. And tune into the cinemas to see me as the next James Bond in theaters coming soon. Please forward this message on to the producers. Forward this video to the producers. I will consider this my audition for the role of Bond. And now I will clearly read from all the scripts in a 24-hour telethon. Here I am just having fun with you all. So absolutely, thanks for watching. Follow me on all social media platforms, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, etc., etc., etc. Thanks so much for tuning in. And remember, the name's Bond. James Bond. Hello, and welcome to the Adam Kiss Show. I'm Adam Kiss, and today I have a very special episode for you. I'm going to be talking about all things James Bond. And it's going to be a very James Bond-centric... a very James Bond-centric episode. Please disregard that. Come and introduce yourself. This is the great Christina Kiss.
Hello.
Behind the scenes.
Yes, absolutely.
So, to continue, unfazed, this is an episode about all things James Bond. You know. Da-da-dum, ba-da-bum, ba-da-da-da-da. Okay?